Good afternoon, everyone. There will be a picture of a polar bear, so I promise. This is going to be a really interesting presentation, I hope, to everyone, maybe for different reasons. I'm pulling together several different concepts. Some are concepts that we have studied when we are participating in this program. Others you might deal with in your professional or your personal research interests. I couldn't have asked for a better tee-up for this talk than the one we heard just before lunch. And I was joking with someone saying, I wish I had a bingo card every time they said Polycrisis, that I could stamp my card, because we're going to talk about Polycrisis. And I want to build on what you heard this morning to talk about Polycrisis as not something that's overwhelming, doom and gloom. It could be, it might be, but it can also be a tool. It could be a concept that we can use to frame our understanding of a situation and then make some decisions about what we're going to do. So with that, I will start with the standard disclaimer that the opinions shared today are my own and they do not reflect the official position of the United States or any other organization in which I'm affiliated with. And I also want to acknowledge the contributions of Native Alaskans that have come forth and shared their stories, that have put it in writing, and that have informed my research. I could not have learned everything that I'm sharing with you if it were not for these Native Alaskans that came forward to share their personal stories. So welcome to the world of Polycrisis. You may not have heard of Polycrisis until maybe about 2022, and it became a bit of a buzzword when a man named Adam Tooze published his first article in the Financial Times on October 28th, 2022. And just a few weeks later, the World Economic Forum included the term in its 2023 Global Risks Report. We might see Polycrisis as our new reality for the modern world. We had a little bit of discussion about that. It's something for us to think about. What is our business as Homeland Security professionals in the modern world? What should we be prepared for? What should we be thinking about? I suggest that our new reality is that we have multiple systemic crises that have compounding impacts, and they may often result in unpredictable and non-linear behaviors. There's some emerging research just in the past 2 years that is indicating that we can think of Polycrisis as a tool for understanding these ongoing crises, and think about how these crises cross spatial dimensions. They involve interacting systems. We heard Dan and others call it cascading effects. And these happen with local, regional, national elements and global elements, and they could include natural disasters, accidents, and human-made or human caused crises. Here's my research hypotheses. This is something I've been exploring for the past year or so, and it's what I want to talk to you about today, and I welcome your feedback to see if this is something that resonates with you and might be useful in your personal and professional lives. I think that Polycrisis can serve as a practical analytic framework for people in this room, public leaders, emergency planners, crisis managers, Homeland Security professionals, because, for 3 reasons. It can help us understand how these complex crises are built and connected across multiple dimensions. It may help us discern what hazards or threats are the most urgent and important. And it may also help us develop insights to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex systematic crises. So what I'll do in my talk today is I'm going to introduce some of the concepts and theories related to Polycrisis. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Arctic as a complex operating system, and then I'm going to do a deep dive into the recent events happening in the village of Newtok, Alaska, to show how you can use these theories and concepts to analyze a real-world Polycrisis and see how actions taken may change the outcome for these residents. So let's start with what's a crisis. Generally, when we think of a crisis, we are thinking about something that's unpredictable and uncertain, and it's testing the stability of the system. And we know that no two crises might be exactly the same, but there are some features that are common characteristics, and these include the sense of surprise, a sense of urgency, uncertainty, a serious threat, and that there are some kind of potential harms that might be realized. Now, what's a polycrisis? Polycrisis does build on those concepts related to a crisis. It was never, I haven't found anything documented prior to 1999 with the use of the term polycrisis. There were two complexity theorists named Edgar Morin and Anne Bridget Kernan who first introduced the term polycrisis in their book Homeland, Earth. And I think the way they introduced it still stands today as a framework for us to think about what is a polycrisis. What Morin and Kernan said is they challenged readers to think differently about our past, present, and future in light of what they called developing planetary culture that faces no single vital problem, but many vital problems. And they argue that it's this interdependency of these problems and the antagonisms between them, the uncontrolled processes, like I'll use terms like feedback loops in a minute, but they didn't use that then. But they think that this constitutes a general crisis of the planet and is the #1 vital problem for planet Earth. After 1999, there was very little use of the term polycrisis. Between 2013 and 2016, we saw some sustainability scientists and one European politician use it, but really it just wasn't the term in vogue until 2022, as I mentioned, with TEWS and the World Economic Forum. Now, the emerging elements of polycrisis are really similar to the elements of a complex crisis, and you may have studied this at some point, or it's part of your everyday work. So with a complex crisis, we have an unexpected problem that arises in one part of a system, and it quickly spreads to disturb an entire system. And it's generally thought of through like network connectivity, that it spreads like a contagion through the network or through cause and effect between different parts of the system. The other aspect of a complex crisis is that the disruption of the initial system may have spillover effects into other systems. So think systems, think connectivity, think networks. But there's no commonly accepted definition of polycrisis. This is a very new field from like an academic research perspective. There is one think tank in Canada called the Cascade Institute that is devoted to the study of the concept of polycrisis. Polycrisis.org is their website. It's very interesting to see what they have on there. They offer a definition of polycrisis, which I propose we modify, at least for Homeland Security purposes, and that's what you see here on the slide. The reason for this modification, and I'm not going to show the original because that doesn't matter. This is the one we want to focus on. What I've done here is, I think we need to be able to think of crises on any scale, local, because we do think that way as Homeland Security professionals. We think local, regional, we think municipal, we think state, we think in terms of governments and resources and private sector. So we need to have a concept that can cross these multiple dimensions and recognizes that there's multiple types of systems involved. So that's the definition that I offer that we use to think about polycrisis. A little more theory, and then we'll get to a lot of pictures. Okay, so what I've put on here are some of the theoretical foundations that are feeding into this concept, this framework of polycrisis. It builds on 3 well-established disciplines that you're likely familiar with. So systems thinking, risk management, and complexity science. And it takes really the best of all of that to bring it together. It's also important for us to remember that when we're talking as Homeland Security professionals, when we use the term security, I offer that we think of security as comprehensive security rather than human or hard or traditional security. And so that's really important because this bullseye chart on the right here, these axes, they show the substantive dimensions of security. We have people from all parts of that in this room today. And then the reference, who are we talking about? Who's affected by this? Is it the state? Sure, those of us who are federal, we're thinking from a state perspective. Social, those that we're thinking about those that are most impacted by some of these issues. And then the individual. What's the danger, threat, vulnerability, risk? Very common combination of terms that we use. And then geographic, I mentioned. So, and these are, again, elements I'm bringing into this that no one else is talking about right now, but I think it could work for us in the Homeland Security field. So we need to think multidimensionally, we need to think in securities, and we need to focus on, and this is important for us because while traditional security is like state threats, we're also very concerned, but most significantly in the Arctic region and the US Arctic, we're thinking about non-state actors. So these are things like human smuggling, drug smuggling, illegal immigrants, illegal fishing. There might be terrorists, but there's also rising temperatures, natural disasters, extreme weather. So we do need to have this comprehensive idea of what security is and who's being affected. And that really makes sense when you're talking about multiple systems. So here it is. This is my offering to you. It's a 3-step process. So when you remember all the terrible things that we talked about this morning, see if you could apply these 3 steps and work the problem. So the first step, and I'm going to go through each of the steps in the next few slides. So first, we heard STEEP, that was mentioned briefly this morning. PESTLE is a variation of it. It's a mnemonic framework that stands for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. And what we do is we identify using these terms, these concepts, we ask questions, like shown on the right, to understand the most important elements of the system. So under the political system, leadership, parties, funding, priorities. Under legal, what laws are we talking about? What governance framework? Where's the source of power in the region? Who makes the decisions? So you ask these questions to visualize the systems that are involved in the operating environment that you are responsible for working in. And then what you need to do is identify whether an element is a stress, a trigger, or a crisis. Because you're going to need to model, you get to do some drawing. So those who think spatially, who like to diagram, this is for you. This is the step that you love. So put your analytic person on step 1 to make those lists, to understand the historical background, the current situation. And now we have the basic model of crisis interaction. This might be a review for some. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty straightforward. What we have is our slow processes. These are happening now. And then there's some kind of trigger. It's something fast. It's something that comes in, and that's what causes the crisis. So in a pretty closed system, you can sort that out pretty quickly. But we're talking polycrisis, many crises, many systems. And so this is why this framework is helpful, because you start with one system, political, you start with another, economic, but then you could start saying, okay, well, I might have these political, economic, legal stresses, and then there was this triggering event. Maybe it's an election, maybe it's a hurricane, something like that. This is an example that's being used often to explain polycrisis, and it goes back to the pandemic. And it shows how some ongoing stresses in our healthcare system were exacerbated by the pandemic, by the surge in the need. The fact that we're global allowed for the pandemic to travel more faster. So you start seeing how a pandemic is a crisis, but it can also be a stress. And so it leads to stress in another system. I like this slide. This is another way to visualize your environment and what's going on. A stability landscape. So what's going on in here is you're trying to, normally, This is where we're at. And it's like a wave. It's just up and down. You're a little boat going up and down. It's all fine. There's a degree of up and down that a system can tolerate, and it stays in this state. This is the stability that it normally is. But when we talk about that fast-moving stressor, it creates the crisis. And so this is a useful slide for trying to envision your end state. What are you trying to do? Because there's three options. One is you can make it through the crisis, and then you are in a new up and down, and that's going to be your new norm. Another is if you can remove that sudden triggering event or some of the stresses, maybe you're back here, and you can just go back to your up and down and the way life was before. Or it might just stay here until you figure out what you need to do. And it will be in a state of disequilibrium. So that's the theory. Now let's get to a lot of pictures and how to apply the theory. There's my polar bear picture from the North Pole. So when I say, hey, what do you think about when you think of the Arctic? Many of you might do like I do, and we think about polar bears and we think about ice. If you think about penguins, you're in the wrong part of the world. Penguins are on the south. Polar bears are in the north. So when we finish CHDS, we don't get a degree in how to make PowerPoint, so I admit I made this. It's very basic, but what I actually drew this. I sketched it in my research journal, and then I tried to put some pictures. This is what I think of when I think of the Arctic. I think of it as a really complex operating space because there's so much happening that's going on between the communities and the demographics, and you have indigenous First Nation people, you have economic, wildlife, science, military, there's just a lot. And that's also why I find this a fascinating area of the world to be researching and to be thinking about policy and justice issues. So what I want to do is I want to just break down a couple of ways for us to think about the Arctic. And I do this just to frame, so when we talk about this village, you're going to hear about this village in Alaska, but keep in mind like the larger picture of what's going on and how some of these dynamics are affecting these people. So it's very common for us to define any space by geography and political units. So when we think about the Arctic, we generally talk about the area above the Arctic Circle, which is the line of latitude above 66.5 degrees north of the equator. There's 8 nations that are known as the Arctic 8, and their land or their exclusive economic zone is within that space, and those are Canada, Denmark, because they are managing Greenland. That's not the right term, managing, I'm sorry. My political science term is eluding me right now. Norway, Russia, the US, Finland, Iceland, and Sweden. So those are the Arctic 8. The United States is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. And just to review our history, Russia sold Alaska to the US on October 18th, 1867, and it became a state in 1959. And who owns Alaska? That's actually really important to know if you're looking at the US Arctic. The federal government owns 61% of Alaska. The state owns 24.5%. And Native Alaskan corporations and villages own 10%. We can also think about Arctic as a space that we can define by people, culture, and economic activities. These would be things that would be unique to this space. So what you have here is a map of the major indigenous people in the Arctic. And so something to keep in mind, it's maybe not as clear as we'd want to see here, but some of the indigenous people, they're not restrained by those political borders. They cross. So for example, the Inuit in Greenland, they share some of the same cultural traditions as the Inuit in Canada and in Alaska. There are approximately 1 million people that are indigenous in the Arctic, and that's about 9% of the total population. We also have lots of economic activity. This is a picture of our pipeline up in Alaska. According to the US Geological Society, the Arctic is estimated to have over 90 billion barrels of oil, 30% of the world's untapped natural gas, and over $1 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. This is a picture of the second largest open mine in the world. It's outside of Mir, Russia, and it's a diamond mine. There's also a very large nickel mine and other kinds of mining and extractive industries. By now, you have also likely heard in the news about the change in the ice thickness, and what that means is we have more activity, more maritime activity in the Arctic region. And that will likely only continue with both more commercial and civilian, like tourism, happening in there. What's really significant to also keep in mind is currently the traffic that typically goes through the Suez Canal to go from Asia to the Americas, that's about 11,000 nautical miles. Going through the Panama Canal is about 12,000 nautical miles. And around the Cape of Good Hope is 14,000. If we're able to do what's called the Northern Sea Route, which is by Russia's border, that's 6,900 nautical miles. So that's a really significant reduction in the amount of time, the distance. Now, there's other factors to consider about cost and danger and so on, but it's certainly being looked at, and it's a factor when thinking about the Arctic region. What's happening then is we're seeing, I love this slide here, showing the amount of transit through the Bering Strait. So Russia, Alaska, US here, and how it breaks down by the type of transit. We have essentially doubled in over 10 years the amount of traffic that's coming through the Bering Strait. So a lot of economic interest. This is Murmansk Harbor. Murmansk, Russia is the largest city in the Arctic. It has over 300,000 people. So it's not just polar bears. Like, there are a lot of people, there's a lot of activity happening. For Russia, the Arctic is a vital source of their economic stability, with 20% of its gross domestic product and approximately 75% of its oil and 95% of its natural gas coming from the Arctic. So Russia is expanding its ports, and they are planning more shipping. So you see here, this is a picture of military bases in the Arctic. Also maybe familiar to you, as you've heard about the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland. Because of that expansion, all of these nations in NATO must be able to train. So this is a picture of a special operations interoperable exercise happening in Alaska. We also see that there's a lot of interest in Greenland. If you are a fan of The Diplomat television show, there is a good explanation of why Greenland matters. Among other things, the waters between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK are known as the Giuk Gap, G-I-U-K. It's the only way that Russia can come through to access some of the ports in Europe. So there's just a lot of strategic value and a lot of economic resources and wealth. So with that as background, let me tell you about the village of Newtok, Alaska, and I'm going to use that as a framework to show how you can use that polycrisis analysis for a real-world polycrisis. So the village of Newtok, it's a coastal community. So US, Alaska, this is part of Alaska. It is located on the Yukon Delta region, and it's a traditional Yupik Eskimo village. Because they're so isolated, you can only reach them by plane or boat. They were living in pretty much isolation until the mid-20th century. So they were really able to preserve a lot of their cultural traditions and their subsistence lifestyle. The people used to live up here in this village called Kayalivik, but that changed in the 60s when the Bureau of Indian Affairs mandated that all children had to go to a school. And so the choice was to send the children away or build a school. So they chose to build a school, and they had to find a new location because where they were at was getting flooded seasonally. So they chose Newtok, which was the furthest up the river that a barge could go and bring the supplies needed to build the school. So that's why they chose their location in the 60s. So they built the school. Here's an overhead picture from 2019. So you can see lots of water, wetland, a lot of subsistence lifestyle that comes from that, with berry picking, with fishing, with trapping, with hunting. There are approximately 300 residents in the village, with 96% of them being Native Alaskans. So they relocated the village. They started building permanent structures because they used to live between different camps seasonally based on what they were harvesting. And soon they realized that they had an existential threat to their community. So this is a picture. See this dotted line down here? 1954, when they were relocating, this is where the land was. This is where it is now, and this is where it's projected. The river is eroding towards the village an average rate of 64 feet a year. And that may increase some years based on the ice jams, windstorms. They had a typhoon that hit, Typhoon Merbok hit this village as well as other villages in Alaska in 2022. The village is also built on permafrost, and as we're learning, the permafrost is not staying frozen all year anymore. And so what that means is it's not able to bear weight like it used to. So the infrastructure, the houses, the walkways, this is what happens. This is the road that was into Newtok, and just the permafrost has just collapsed. And so all we have is that top level of the road left. We have houses that were here that are not here anymore, and these are starting to crumble. Constantly wet with snow or melted snow, requiring boardwalks to move in between the school and community building and the houses, the playground for the kids. Let's see how polycrisis analysis can be applied here. So we start out, step one, remember, is the environmental scanning, which I recommend pestle, but you can use steep, you could use whatever you prefer, but the key is focus in and identify the key elements in the systems involved in whatever you're working, whatever your challenge is, whatever your area of responsibility is. So for Newtok, these are just some. What I'm sharing with you today is going to be published later this year in a book. So this is just an extract. So political, the types of political things, I mentioned it could be an election. For Newtok, they had things like, they had a leadership crisis in their village where there was an election in 2012, and the leaders that had been the elected leaders refused to recognize the new elected leaders as the leadership. And so they actually had to go to court and get an injunction and publish it and say any contracts signed by these individuals are not valid because they are not authorized to speak on behalf of our village. So these are some of the things that can be happening in communities that have nothing to do with, say, a hurricane or a weather event. These are other dynamics that affect what your options are and how you need to prioritize things. Other things going on. This is a big one. Economic. They don't make very much money. There's a subsistence lifestyle. So how do they pay for a new village? So they had to find a significant amount of money, and you may have heard it took over 20 years. They still haven't quite finished the relocation. They're almost done, but they needed to find hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a new airport and a runway. The families, as they were starting to move over the course of 12 plus years, were being split, where one family is in the new location and one family is in the old location. When there were floods and then the hurricane, no running water. Well, actually, they've never had a working sewer system. That's a challenge that hasn't really been solved in the Arctic regions, is how do you have flush toilets in a region like that? So they use honeypots. They've been doing it for years, and they continue to do that. But they do have to dump the waste, and their landfill and their depot got flooded, which went into their freshwater supply. So these cause sanitary issues, they cause healthcare issues. You can start seeing why I'm calling this a polycrisis. All these different things happening. So we now need to take that analysis and start visualizing. And just as I started a few minutes ago talking about just a single system, that may be a good way to start. Just do a single system analysis. And this one is just looking at the environmental system. So what do we have? These have been ongoing for decades. The permafrost is melting, or it's just not as stable. It can't hold weight like it did. And we've got the coastal erosion. Trigger, there was a flood in 1996. What happened? They lost a significant amount of habitat because of that one event. So then we start putting a few systems together. I know it's hard for a presentation like this or to have in a book to see, but so you want big whiteboards, you want space, but start modeling out, and you can see the interactions where the full scale of the polycrisis starts becoming more obvious. And you can start seeing how these interactions and the feedback loops, this is causing a problem with this is causing more here. It provides a holistic look at a community or at a situation. And what it also allows us to do is we can start seeing, well, what's the most vulnerable element or the most influential element, either in a system or multiple systems. And you're probably, I see a few heads nodding because you're probably thinking, we have to make decisions. We have to decide where to spend our limited resources of time and money and people. So knowing how to prioritize is really valuable. That's as far as me taking what some others, like the Cascade Institute, is doing with diagramming. And now I want to tell you like the really cool stuff that I'm working with some people in Alaska about. I can't quite do it yet, but maybe you have people on your team that can do some of this stuff. This is called a domino diagram. And this is me, again, we don't get a PowerPoint degree when we come out of here, so this is me trying to show connections. The key thing about a domino diagram is it's by time. So we started in the 50s. So when a stress emerges, you put it on your chart. What I can't quite visualize for you guys is whether it continues to the present and into the future or not. So it will probably be helpful if a stress removes, that you're able to somehow show that. I have some ideas for you, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But what we can see is, look at all these arrows here. Wow, this is really vulnerable. This is something we have got to remedy. And what it says, if you can't see it back there, villagers continue to live in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. Personally, for the book, I started labeling. So I have like S1, S2, stress 1, stress 2, so I can keep track. Because if I wrote out all the stresses, you can't see it in here. So that's what these numbers are. They go back to that chart that I had. And then when we see a lot of arrows coming out of something, we're like, that's really influential. We need to pay attention. Maybe there's something we need to do about that. But there's a lot there. It's really busy. And that doesn't quite get us where we need to go, I think, as professionals to make these decisions we need to make. So here's some other ideas. And again, I'm working with somebody in Alaska who is very good at ArcGIS and is working with communities there to try and assess what's going on in their community. Some communities don't even have addresses, like 911 codes. So they're literally they're taking a map and they have the houses and they're putting numbers. And these are the things that are happening in these communities. But one idea is you can do a community stress table. I can really see this being helpful maybe for a municipal, a county, or maybe a state, where the font is little, but each of those stresses, like the flooding, the lack of money, you can assign a value, like 1 to 10. And 10 being the higher stress and 1 being the least. And you could also do start and end dates. So we put this in an Excel spreadsheet. Here's what comes out of it if you start doing this. You could start seeing the overlap, and you can start visualizing. And if you're trying to talk to an elected official and you have 5 minutes in the hallway before they go in for their vote or their meeting, look how powerful that can be, especially if you intentionally chose your colors a certain way to show, look, in our systems here, they're ongoing. We started with, the legal stress for Newtok is the land they needed to move to was owned by the federal government. So it took literally an act of Congress to give them the land in order to then start the relocation. So that took a while, and it went away for a while when they got the act of Congress, but then there were other issues, like they asked for Stafford Act funding, and the Obama administration at the time said slow motion disasters are not eligible for these kinds of funds. So, but it just can show the compounding effects of various stresses and various systems in your community. You can also then, this is again not me, this is the guy in Alaska who's much better than I, but if you take, this is again the aerial view of Newtok, and you could start putting on things like that same data, you could do pivot tables, you could focus in on one system or another. There is something called a permafrost gateway that's publicly available in Alaska. What that does is you can click on a village, and what someone's doing is they're putting every news story and report on that village. So you have ways to use this information to help inform decision making. So let me wrap it up. I think the village of Newtok had a polycrisis, for sure, with multiple stressors, multiple systems, and the cumulative effect was more than just one on their lives and on their environment. Over time, it took over 3 decades, but they were able to, remember the stability landscape and the little ball, they moved into a new stability, state of equilibrium, where they were able to remove some of those stressors by essentially moving. Not all are gone, but at least they're in a state of equilibrium that they can live with. But we know that Newtok is not alone. We have other communities that are facing significant and imminent threats. And these stressors can come at multiple levels, the national, the regional, the local, and they're crossing multiple dimensions. So what I offer to you today to think about is that polycrisis can allow us to get a holistic look at a community, at an environment, at a problem set, and we can think about seeing it as a system of systems. And that's a way for us to then get more insight into understanding how changes in one element in one system can affect another, how multiple changes might affect. We can understand that feedback loop and the connections that happen that might then say to us, okay, if we can break this feedback loop, maybe we can just relieve that crisis or that stress just a little bit more. Also, because crises never go away, and that was what I started with, I think this might be our new modern reality, is that there's a constant set of crises going on. We can always just do a reset of, okay, what's going on today? What's now? What's the update? What's changed? Plug it in. Do your pestle analysis again. Are there new elements? Are there new stressors? Are there new triggering events? So it can assist with continuous planning and analysis. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to your feedback and your questions.